want to welcome you to the webinar, Help My Groups Are Stuck at 30%. And the reason I chose 30% is once upon a time I was in a church and my groups were stuck at 30%. And I've discovered that that's actually a very common place for churches to get stuck. And so if you're stuck somewhere else, if you're stuck out the gate, or if you're stuck at a higher percentage, I definitely understand. And some of this will apply to you as well. I know some of you have been on my webinars before, and I thank you for coming back. You may hear a little bit of repetition of a few things that you've heard before, especially when I tell my story. Now, that should be reassuring that my story remains the same and that I don't change my story every time we have a webinar, but it's the real story. But anyways, let me introduce myself. My name is Alan White, and I've been a pastor for over 25 years. My wife Tiffany and I have been married a little over 16 years. We have 4 children. So this year I have one that started high school, one that started middle school, one in 4th grade, and one that started preschool. So we have quite the span in our family. Over the last 11 years, I've coached over 1,500 churches. Some of those I've coached individually. Some of those I coached in a group, or at one point we coached all of the churches that did 40 days of purpose and 40 days of community, and we had 700 churches in 17 different weekly conference calls. So that was a bit of a circus, but that was a lot of fun. Since 2011, I've helped churches start over 14,000 groups. Last year, I worked with 18 churches, and they started over 5,000 groups. This year, I'm working directly with 24 churches, and then I have about 6 others that are doing my online course. And I'm waiting to see what the total is going to be for this fall. We have a lot of great things that are happening across the country. Now, what I do is I work with churches through individual coaching, like I mentioned, coaching groups, online courses. I have a book that's coming out actually on February the 1st, and if you haven't looked at the first chapter of that yet, you can go to my website, just alanwhite.org/ebook, and you can download the first chapter. Book's also available for pre-order on Amazon or on Christian book distributors, and hope you get a copy. I blog at alanwhite.org, and every Tuesday at 10:30 Eastern Time, I have a post that comes out. I had the privilege last year to work with Chip Ingram. He was one of those 18 churches, and Chip's Adventure Christian Church in Los Gatos, California. They're in the middle of Silicon Valley, and they're a church of about 2,200. They wanted to reach a goal of having 400 new groups. They wanted to see a big boost to their existing groups. They had, I think, 110, 120 groups to start with. And lo and behold, that fall, we got to 400 new groups at Venture. And like I said, it's a church of 2,200. And most of those met in homes. They had a few that met on campus, but most of those met on homes. Now, when you registered, I asked you kind of what issues you're facing, what concerns you have, what questions you have about groups. And so this is where I heard from you that you are feeling the pain. Some of it has to come with recruiting new leaders, forming new groups, group health and growth, which is a great thing to be concerned about, because to be honest, to get a bunch of groups started is relatively easy, but to keep those groups healthy on an ongoing basis is a bit more of a challenge. We'll cover a little bit of that today, connecting new people into groups, and there are different ways to do it. Some ways are more effective than other ways, so we'll talk about a few of those today. And then also the idea of vision for groups, the culture of groups, the value for groups, raising that value in your church and making groups more visible. And so we can discuss some of these things as we go. So let's talk about this. Why do groups get stuck at 30%? Here's some of the reasons that I've come up with. One of the reasons that churches get stuck with 30% in groups is that you already have the low-hanging fruit. The innovators, the early adopters, the folks that are willing to try something just even out of loyalty for the church and the senior pastor, most of those people, if you have 30%, most of those people have already stepped forward to lead groups, which is, kind of good news, bad news. So most of the early adopters are in. Maybe you're at 30% because you're still handpicking your leaders. And so I know for churches that, you personally recruit, select leaders like I used to way back when. You don't know everybody. And in a church of any size, you certainly don't know everybody. And especially those that would consider themselves capable or desiring to lead in some way. Maybe you're only forming groups with one strategy. And I'll just break the news to you now. One size does not fit all. And what got you to 30% of your adults in groups might get you to 50% of your adults in groups. But for me, in order to get further than 30%, we had to try something new. And then after that, we had to try something else that was new. And after that, and I'm not talking about replacing one strategy with another strategy. What I'm talking about is adding an additional strategy, that if somebody said no to what you're currently offering, then what could you give them that they might say yes to? And so there's no law that says you only have to do groups one way in your church. And so that I'm going to point that out early on. I'll probably come back to that in a little bit. Sometimes you get stuck at 30% because you're coaching the leaders by yourself. You don't have a coaching structure. They're calling you. They're depending on you. And depending on the size of your church, you're going to max yourself out very, very quickly. And I don't know about you, the two churches that I've served in, I've never had the luxury of only being the small groups pastor. I usually had other responsibilities on my plate. And so, I couldn't devote 100% of my time to small groups. I didn't have, staff. And if that sounds like you, then I'm going to tell you some of the ways that I figured it out. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. And like I said, for those of you who've heard it, you can play Angry Birds or something for a while here. But for those of you who haven't, I hope you can follow along. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to show you kind of where I've come from and what I've learned. And I hope you can identify with this at some points and be able to, follow along and learn some things just from my struggle. I graduated from seminary in 1990 and went to a church in Northern California in the Central Valley called New Life Christian Center. And it was a church of about 300 adults when I first arrived there. I was there about a year and a half, and some things were found out about our founding pastor who'd been there for 17 years, and he was asked to resign. And if you follow my blog, I blogged about this a couple months ago. After, what happened with Perry Noble at New Spring, where we attend now. But it was a very hard thing. In fact, it was a hard year of my life going through all of this. And so, of course, what happens then is when the pastor resigns, then the attendance goes down. And all of the staff left except for me. About over 2/3 of our congregation left. And so we had about 85 people and me. And that's about all that we had that worked. So at the very end of 1992, I was 28 at the time. Our new pastor came on staff. He was 30. And to say that we were green was an understatement. And so the very first thing we did in 1993, he took me down to Orange County, California, to hear this guy I had never heard of named Rick Warren talk about the purpose-driven church. And we were so filled with vision. We were so excited about the possibilities of what God could do in our church. And we came back and looked at our 85 people and we thought, how in the world are we going to do any of this? But, we began to build on the purpose-driven model a piece at a time. And this isn't trying to sell the purpose-driven model. If your church follows a different model, then groups are going to work for you too. But as we began to build this a piece at a time, what we discovered was that our church didn't grow dramatically, but we grew very regularly by about 100 people a year. And at the end of 12 years when I left, we were about 1,500 on the weekend. Now they're over 3,000, 3,500. They're building a new building. Same pastor's there. He's been there for 22 years now, and or 24 years. I get my math right. And they're doing really, really great. Now, one of the things we learned from Rick Warren was that a church has to grow larger and smaller at the same time. And what that means is as your attendance is growing, then you get to about 250 people in your church and people say, well, I don't know everybody anymore. And you get to about 400 at your church, and especially if you go then to multiple services, then people get the sense of, I can't find the people that I know. And then when you get, well beyond that in numbers and you go multi-site, well, then you're almost, everybody's in the same church, but it seems like a lot of different churches. So we began to grow our groups and began to make this 5-year plan of how we were going to increase our groups every year. And so the first year I handpicked 10 leaders and trained them. I encouraged them, instructed them, demanded for them to find an apprentice leader who they would train up, and then the next year their group would divide or multiply, however you want to say that, birth, and start another group, and then we would add some other groups to it. So maybe the first year we had 10 groups, and the next year we had 25 groups, and went on and on until we kept pace with the growth of the church, or at least caught up. It didn't quite go like that. There were a lot of ups and downs. Some years I recruited, launched 10 groups. Some years I launched 2 groups. Some years I launched no groups. And we got to the point where we were 7 years into the 5-year plan, and we were stuck. And so at that point, I had heard some things that were going on at Saddleback, and this guy named Brett Eastman that founded a ministry called Life Together. And so I went down and heard Brett talk, for a day about how churches were multiplying groups without dividing groups, and how new people were working better in new groups, and heard from several churches that he had been working with about some of the results that they had seen, and got really excited about what was going on, in the church community in general. And so then on my drive back home, I began to think about, okay, how could any of these ideas actually work in my church? Because my church was not a Saddleback. And so I began to think about this, and it dawned on me, at the time, our pastor was very excited about the Passion of the Christ. And he'd already planned a sermon series. This was 2004. He'd already planned a sermon series to coincide for when the movie was released, because he knew once people saw the movie, took their friends to the movie, that they would have a lot of spiritual questions. So he planned his sermon series. He planned some advertising. And I walked into his office. I said, Pastor Dave, I said, what would you think if we launched groups off of the Passion of the Christ? And he said, I think that's a great idea. Because he was already excited about the Passion of Christ. And so I just kind of piggybacked on his idea. Now, for most of my ministry, most of my 25 years, 26 years now, I've either been an associate pastor, a discipleship pastor, the minister of Christian education, I was originally called, or even in my consulting years, the vice president. It was only a year ago I went to work for myself. But in that role, in that, kind of second chair kind of role, what I discovered was things went better with groups if I chose to follow where my pastor was leading and tried to align what we were doing with groups with where he was headed in his sermon series, or the needs or the vision that he had for the church in the coming year. That if I could somehow marry that idea to small groups, we would get better traction with groups. Instead of being frustrated, and instead of wishing he would talk about it more, instead of being antagonistic, I mean, you're not going to get anywhere doing that. Not that we don't get frustrated, but you know what I'm saying. So he agreed to do this. I said, well, here's the deal. I said, I found a study guide for our groups, but we need to make this easy for anybody to use. And so we need to make a video. And I said, Pastor Dave, you need to be on that video. So we made the videos. We were 1 week ahead of our groups, and we output it on VHS tape. This is back in the day. And every week I ran this tape exchange for my office. So every week they would bring in last week's tape. I would give them next week's tape, and then I'd take last week's tape to the duplicator, and it would become next week's tape. And it was a bit crazy. We shot these 1 week ahead of when the groups needed it. Man, I wish we would have had Right Now Media back then. We could just put them up on the site. But here was the trick in all of this. As quick and dirty as this sounded, because we just decided to do the small group study 3 weeks before the series started. He stood up on a Sunday morning and he said, we've developed these materials for you. And if you would agree to open up your home and do one of these groups, then we'll help you get the group started. We doubled our groups in 1 day. Now, bear in mind, it had taken 7 years to get to the place where we were, and we doubled our groups in a single day. In fact, 6 months later, we were actually at a point where we had 125% of our average adult attendance in small groups. We had more people in a weekly group than we had in the worship service on the weekend. Now, that isn't funny pastor math. We had groups that met in break rooms at work. We had groups that met in a coffee shop. I had a group that met on a commuter train that went from Stockton, California to San Jose every day. And so we gave our people permission, a little flexibility to get creative with this, and gave them an opportunity for in their context with their friends that they already have a relationship with people that they know who would benefit from the study. And they embraced that and began to invite people that they knew to be part of these groups. Fast forward, I moved to Greenville, South Carolina 9 years ago and was on staff at Brookwood Church. Brookwood is a church of about 6,500, and they were about 40% connected into groups. We did our first series, again, based on our pastor's teaching, about 8 years ago. It was called Wrestling with God. It was with the life of Jacob. And I just came across a list of all the leaders' names from that series. And in that first series, we had 600 group leaders lead a study for at least 6 weeks for wrestling with God. And so, I'm speaking from things that I've experienced. That's why I get excited about this, to see how you can take an easy-to-use tool, put it in the hands of your group members, and people that never considered themselves to be leaders will gather a group of friends and do an easy-to-use study for 6 weeks. Let me tell you about a couple of churches that I've worked with. Van Dyke Church is a great United Methodist church north of Tampa, Florida. When I first met them 5 years ago, they were a church of about 1,800 adults on the weekend. They were stuck at 30%. They had about 400 people in groups. Worked with them to help their team produce their own curriculum. We added a few new strategies, and then we added 60 new groups the first time out. And so in round one, we actually had 1,000 people connected in groups. We did 2 more rounds of this, and by the time we were finished after that first 9 months, we had more people in groups than they had on the weekend. I just did an interview, a webinar a few weeks ago with Matthew Hartsfield, the pastor, and now 5 years later, their church has grown to 2,300 adults on the weekend, and they're still maintaining 80 to 90% of their adult attendance in groups. And to me, this is an important story because it shows you that not only can you launch a bunch of things and get a bunch of excitement going, but ways that groups can continue, and ways that groups can continue for the long term and truly become the means of connecting and discipling people in your church. Pastor Troy Jones is a picture there, is at New Life Church in Renton, Washington. When I met Pastor Troy, they had 2,500 adults on the weekend. They were stuck at about 40% of their adults in groups. We helped them produce some curriculum, again, added some different strategies, different ways of presenting groups to the congregation, the different ways of presenting group leadership to the congregation, and we added 400 new groups. So this church of 2,500 within 6 months had 500 small groups because Pastor Troy caught the vision of people inviting their friends into the comfort of their living room, watching the pastor's teaching on video, and some of the people had never been to the church before. And so he caught the vision of, and this is Washington State. This is not the Bible Belt. And so he thought, the more people I have open up their homes and use the curriculum, it became not just a way to retain members in the church, it also became a way of connecting people in the community to the church in a meaningful way. He got so excited about this, he said his next goal is to have 1,000 groups in a church of 2,500 adults. I told him he was thinking too small, that he needed to just go for it and have 2,500 groups in a church of 2,500 adults. Because you don't have to have, 25,000 people, participating that attend your church. You just need to have 2,500 people that'll lead. But I think 1,000 is pretty ambitious. So again, when we talked about why people get stuck at 30%, you have the low-hanging fruit, You already have your early adopters. Maybe you're handpicking leaders. Maybe you're only using one method to form groups. Maybe you're the only one that's supporting and coaching them. So let's talk about breaking through this 30% barrier. And so first of all, you want to open up leader recruiting. And we're going to go through each of these points in detail. The second thing you want to think about is to consider new curriculum options. So you have a certain way of doing curriculum now, whether you're writing a weekly discussion guide or purchasing curriculum or doing Right Now Media. Maybe there's another way that we need to think about in developing curriculum. You need to get your senior pastor to recruit new leaders. And here's my secret. I have not personally recruited a small group leader since 2004. And I was in the church in California for 2 more years, and then I was at the church here in South Carolina for 4 years, but I have not personally recruited a group leader since 2004 because I got my senior pastor to do all of that. And we'll talk about how you can make that happen. You want to get your coaching structure started. Don't feel guilty about it. Don't feel embarrassed about it. You just need to get it started. And then let me emphasize this. I'll say a little more now and then a little more later. You want to leave your established groups alone. You know, it's one thing to say, well, this method has gotten us this far, and so, but it's not going to get us all the way. So let's throw out this method. Let's try a new method of doing groups. Well, that doesn't work because you have people that what you've been doing is working for 30% of your congregation. If you're at stuck at 30%, so you want to keep that going, but you want to try something in addition to that method without upsetting it. Even if your church has adult Sunday school, if Sunday school is working for somebody and they've been faithful to that, and that's where they fellowship with other believers, that's where they're growing, I wouldn't throw out Sunday school. I would keep Sunday school and just add other things to it. So let's talk about opening up your leader recruitment. What are your requirements to lead a group? And we use, the term leadership, that has a certain connotation, a certain expectation to it. So maybe we don't say leadership. Some places they say host. Some places we talk about get together with your friends and do the study. Some places we talk about get together with one other person and do the study. The idea is to give someone an opportunity to give this a try to see whether or not they like it. And maybe we delay some of the requirements to the end. But, I mean, if you're looking for the next Billy Graham, the next Mother Teresa, that's going to be a little hard to come by. Maybe you require people to be members of your church. That's not necessarily bad. Maybe you want to see a certain level of maturity. Maybe you want them to do a certain amount of training. I've had churches that said, we have 1 year of a leadership development process before anybody gets to be a leader in our church. And I think, oh my goodness, how do you ever get to be a leader in this church? You have to go through a year. Maybe you're looking for somebody that has their Master of Divinity. I don't know. But you want to begin to think about how can we open up ways of recruiting leaders and maybe adjust the qualifications so people can lead for at least a season before they commit to long term. And so the first thing you have to come to is asking yourself, what is your acceptable level of risk? I mean, I have churches that have very high requirements that people have to meet before they can lead anything. I have other churches that as long as the person is breathing, then they let them do a group. I don't know that breathing would be my qualification. I think as long as somebody has friends, then they can lead a group. I don't know, maybe breathing is too low. But, maybe anyone could lead. Maybe anyone could lead if they meet certain qualifications. Maybe anyone could lead after they've been vetted. A big part in this is to say, are we recruiting people that we are going to advertise? We're going to promote their groups. We're going to send people to their groups. You need more qualifications there. But if you're going to promote groups, invite people to lead groups with folks that they already know and invite their friends, well, maybe you don't need as many qualifications because these groups are not public and their friends are going to know what they're getting into. So a few years ago, I worked with Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas, Dr. Tony Evans, and asked their team, I said, now, what requirements are you going to have for leaders? And they said, well, anybody that's going to be, they called it a host, anybody who's going to host a group needs to be a member of our church. And I thought, oh man, we're sunk. We're not going to start 50 groups. I said, well, how many members do you have? They said, well, we have 7,000 members. I said, I think I can work with that. And so then we went to the next obstacle. And that was, they said, in order for somebody to be a leader at our church, they need to go through a 1-year leader training process. And it was like, oh no, well, see you next year. But what I knew, because part of the team was Dr. Evans' daughter, Crystal, and Crystal Hurst. And I knew that Dr. Evans was open to the idea of letting other people try it without going through the year of training. And so what we did was we delayed the formalized training for them to do a 6-week study based on Dr. Evans' book, Destiny. And so we gave them a briefing to the leaders. We gave them support. And when it was all said and done, Dr. Evans recruited 500 new group leaders to lead that Destiny series, to lead groups for that Destiny series in their church. So again, sometimes we need to think about what we're requiring, how we're requiring. I mean, some of these things I was talking about, I'm talking about now. I mean, 14 years ago, I was scared to death of some of these things and the disaster that this would heap upon my church. And here's the crazy thing about it. As I began to try some new things, I discovered that the problems were not nearly as significant as I ever imagined. In fact, for me personally, the greatest obstacle I had to ever overcome was in my own thinking. And once my thinking began to change, then our results also began to change. Maybe another thing to think of is to change up your curriculum. So is your curriculum or your sermon discussion guide getting in the way? Maybe you're depending on, people have to be there on Sunday, or the person has to do a little teaching in the group. Because I don't know about you, when I've invited people to lead a small group, what I get is they say, well, I'm not a leader. I'm not a teacher. And so some of the things I'd like you to think about is if you only do a weekly discussion guide, if that's what you're using right now with your group, is they have a discussion based on the sermon, that I would encourage you maybe to add video to that. And so I've got a church in Ontario, Canada, that what they do is they meet between the services, the small group director and the pastor, and they do a 5-minute interview, and she records it on her iPhone. And they put it up on YouTube. And then when they send out the discussion guide to their leaders, there's a link in the discussion guide. They click the link. They get exclusive content from the senior pastor. And so they love it. They really, really love it. Now, this isn't the only way to do this, but what I'm saying is if you have a discussion guide and it's worked okay, but it hasn't gotten you to where you want to go, you may want to add something else to it. I would encourage your pastor to create curriculum, to have an alignment series, or just have a curriculum option. This is what I know about pastors. Pastors have content. And if your pastor has been a pastor for 10, 20, 30 years, there are files and files of sermons that are available that you could use with content. Other things that I've done, if we didn't have time to create a series or the pastor didn't want to create a series, is I've gone out, I've purchased curriculum, again, video-based, because we want it easy for anybody to use. I purchased curriculum that went along close enough with the topic or the passage of scripture that a pastor was doing in a series. Now, if your pastor doesn't speak in a series, then I've wasted your time and it's not going to work for you. No, I'm kidding. If your pastor, maybe he'll do one sermon to kick off the small group study, and then we'll do other things. There's more than one way, definitely, to do all of this. But you might want to consider an alignment series. And what I mean by an alignment series is a group study that goes along with the weekend messages. And if this is not something you've ever done in your church, then I would encourage you in your first ministry season, saying that ministry season is from September to May, I would encourage you to do 2 or 3 alignments, because there's something to be said about doing a sequence of these instead of just doing one. So now I want you to answer a question in the chat box, and the answer is yes or no. How many of you have done a church-wide campaign? So tell me yes or no in the chat box real quick, whether you've done what or not. Okay, got a yes, 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 got a no. Couple more yeses, one more no. Okay, we got a lot of yeses. Okay, now how many of you, the first time you did a church-wide campaign or an alignment series, how many of you, the first time you did the series, saw a dramatic drop-off in groups after that 6-week study was over? You could answer yes or no again. So how many of you saw a dramatic drop-off? Okay, we got yeses. Oh, Denise says no. So we're going to find out what you did, Denise. Quinn says no. All right, we're going to find out what you did, Quinn. Adrian says yes. Okay. So, okay, Cynthia says not a huge one, but Cynthia, your church is exceptional, so I think that's why. Only a small drop-off. That's good, Kara. I'm glad it was only small. I've seen some crazy things happen. And there are ways definitely to avoid that and to keep groups going. One of those things is to do a sequence where you have maybe a fall study, a New Year's study, an Easter study, and they go from one series into another. And I've even had groups that we would launch after Easter, and the first week in May, we would announce to them, oh, by the way, our next study is going to launch the second week in October. And put this on your calendar. And I was really surprised to get to October and find 80% of the groups that started after Easter right there ready to go. And if I hadn't witnessed that myself, I wouldn't have believed it. Now, if you're already doing this, like the case of Van Dyke Church, that they did 3 their first year, but then after that they backed off and they're only doing 1 or 2 a year. And again, it gives momentum to groups, gives on-ramps, easy on-ramps for people to start connecting into groups. And it again puts groups front and center in the life of a church. You don't want to wear people out. They can get what I call campaign fatigue after a while. But for most churches, within 1 to 3 years, you should be able to take some of these things that I'm talking about, and within 1 to 3 years, have the majority of your members, your regular attenders, connected into groups. All right, so consider an alignment, or consider just offering curriculum maybe in a little different way. Add a video, offer curriculum for every series that starts at your church. There are a lot of different ways to do this. The next thing is this. You want to make your senior pastor the small group champion. Now, how do you get your senior pastor more interested in groups? That's the question, right? Well, the first thing is put your pastor on the curriculum. Because if you put your pastor on the curriculum, first of all, your pastor is going to be more interested. So Matthew Hartsfield at Van Dyke Church, I'm talking about a lot today, but he's a good story. I've got a lot of good stories, but he's the one I'm going to use today. So we spend a day with their team, and their team does all the shooting for the video, and he shoots his teaching segments for the video. And then the next morning, he calls us into his office, and he says, now we've shot this video, we're creating this curriculum. Now, how do we recruit leaders, and how do we get people connected into groups? And his discipleship pastor comes to me later in the day, and he says, I've been trying to get my pastor interested in groups for 2 years. He said, and you just did it. It was almost like an accusation. He said, you did it. You just did it. And I just smiled at him and said, well, you know, I'm Alan White. No, I did not say that. But the key was this, and I actually talked to Matthew about this the other day on our webinar, was that now that he had something invested, he had invested his teaching into the small group curriculum, and he wanted the small group curriculum to succeed because he had made an investment in that, and he wanted people to use it. So he became more interested in the curriculum once people started to use, you know, once he had shot the video. Here's the other thing. Your pastor will be more interested in, or I mean, your people would be more interested in the curriculum. Your pastor will be more interested. Your people will be more interested. Think about this. If your people are not already connected to each other, the only reason that they attend your church other than Jesus Christ is because of your senior pastor. They like his personality. They like his teaching style. They laugh at his jokes. The reason that they're there is because of your senior pastor. Now, let me caution you. Don't share this information with your worship pastor. It'll break his heart. But the reason that they're there is because of your senior pastor. And like I said, I've been an associate for a long time. They're not there because of me. They're there because of pastor. And so when our pastor stood up, when your pastor stands up and says, we prepared this curriculum for you based on my teaching, I would like you to open up your home and host a group. I'd like you to get together with some friends and do this study together. then that's a grand slam home run, because you're giving your people more of what they're already interested in, which is your pastor's teaching, and your pastor is giving them direction and leadership related to groups. And this works better than if you do Rick Warren or Bill Hybels or Andy Stanley, anybody else's curriculum. To have your pastor on the curriculum is far better. Now, if you use the other campaigns that you purchase and that's what you're able to do, you're still going to get a good result if you apply some of these other principles. But if you want, I mean, that's a home run. But if you want a grand slam home run, then you want to have your pastor on the curriculum. The other way you get a pastor interested in championing small groups is you want to give small groups solutions to your pastor's problems. So what do pastors worry about? Pastors think about things like attendance or spiritual growth, closing the back door of the church, outreach, finances. And I could give you great anecdotes for all of these, tell you great stories of how small groups have done all of this, but instead of that, I'm going to give you some research. And so 2 books, one recently that came out, Transformational Groups by Ed Stetzer and Eric Geiger, as well as a book I used in seminary from Robert Wuthnow, who was a professor at Princeton University, called Sharing the Journey. And this is what the research discovered. And that is this. These studies showed that small groups will increase connection. And this solves the assimilation issue. Most of us are aware of that. Groups will increase spiritual growth. And even spiritual growth outside of the group, of people having a daily quiet time and reading their Bibles and praying. Groups will increase attendance. And they do this in 2 ways. One is that if you have a small group study that's aligned with the sermon series, then people will be more inclined to attend regularly on the weekend because they know that the sermon that's presented on the weekend has something to do with their small group study. And then, of course, the other thing I mentioned was people get invited to a group. Maybe they've never darkened the door of your church, but they get invited to the group. They meet your senior pastor by video. And then when they're invited to come to church, they feel like they already know your pastor because they've just spent 6 weeks in the comfort of their friend's living room watching the pastor's teaching on video. People that are in groups will serve more than people that are not in groups. People in groups will give more than people who are not in groups. In fact, in transformational groups, it tells us that people who are not in groups give about 6% of their income to the church. People that are in groups give more like 10% of their income to the church. So let's think about this. If people in groups give 4% more than people who are not in groups, and you have somebody who joins a group that makes, say, $35,000 a year, well, that means their 4% increased giving amounts to $1,400 for one person or one couple in a church. And then you multiply that times 100 people in groups, 1,000 people in groups. One church that I worked with in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, I will tell you a story now, called Capital Area Christian Church. Last year they launched 2 series. They launched one in the new year and one after Easter. And that's the only thing they did different in their church over 2014. And when the second series was completed, they analyzed the first 6 months of 2015 with the first 6 months of 2014. They made that comparison. Again, the only noticeable difference was they created their own curriculum and encouraged their people to be in groups. What they discovered was that their attendance had increased by 7.5% and their giving had increased by 7%. And again, the only difference was getting people into groups. All right, we need to move on because we have little time and lots to talk about. All right, so the next thing you want to think about is getting your coaching structure started. You don't want to coach alone. You don't want to be the only person to coach. In Exodus 18, Jethro gave this advice to Moses. He said you need to have leaders of 10s, leaders of 50s, leaders of hundreds, and leaders of thousands. Now, in our context, a leader of 10 would more or less be a small group leader. A leader of 50s or hundreds would be a small group coach. And so they would have 5 or 10 groups that they would coach. And then when you get into thousands, then you would develop a leadership team. I called them community leaders. And these would be the leaders of leaders of leaders who would serve as my small group team. So churches under 1,000, your coaches are effectively your small group team. And so the church that I served in California, my coaches were my small group team. The church I served here in Greenville that was 6,500, I had a group of 8 or 10 people that I met with monthly, and that was my small group team. They had coaches. The coaches then had leaders. Now, if you don't have a coaching structure, or if your coaching structure is not very good, then you're in good company, because that's where I was back when I started all of this and I was stuck at 30%. And so don't feel guilty about coaching that hasn't happened. And you also don't want to afflict your established leaders with new coaching, because established leaders will react anywhere from skepticism to resentment that all of a sudden they have a coach and they've never had a coach before. You want to thank God that your current leaders have figured it out and that nothing really bad happened. And so give yourself some credit. You have good leaders that without the benefit or help of a coach, or without much coaching, have managed to figure this out and have been able to continue to your group, which in turn becomes a wonderful asset as you begin to recruit new leaders and form new groups. So if you think about this, if an alignment series, and by that I mean a 6-week series that goes along with a sermon, if this is a trial run for leading a group, we just have somebody kind of take a test drive of what it's like to be a group leader for 6 weeks. They get some friends together. Maybe they have a few people sign up from the church. Well, if that's a trial run for leading a group to see whether or not they like leading, then why couldn't we also use it as a trial run for coaching other leaders? We give them a short-term commitment, and then we evaluate what they do. And so this is what I did with my established leaders, because when I doubled my groups in a day, I had twice the coaching problem I'd had the day before. But then it dawned on me that if I doubled the groups, that means half of the groups knew what they were doing. The other half were new. They didn't know anything. So I matched them up and created the buddy system. And this is what I told them to do. I said, I want you to care enough to call the new leaders at least once a week. From when they signed up until the end of the study, call them once a week, answer their questions and encourage them, and then pray for them. And so after the series, we evaluated this. And for those of you that I'm going too fast, I'm going to give you a copy of this when I'm done. I'll send it out this afternoon. But after the series, we would evaluate the experience of the coaches. Did they enjoy coaching others? Were they effective? Would they like to coach more? And what I found was this either lined up one way or the other. Either they said, yes, I liked coaching others. Yes, it was effective. And, our groups are continuing. And then I would invite them to coach more. For those who said, I didn't feel my role was very important, it was very difficult to contact the new leaders, and most, if not all, of the leaders that I coached are not continuing, I would say thank you very much. You fulfilled your commitment. I really appreciate it. Don't call us. We'll call you. I didn't say that part, but I thought it. And so we went from there. All right, so let's get to this last point, and that is this. You want to leave your established leaders alone. Don't upset the 30%, or whatever percent you're stuck at, because they have found something that works for them. In fact, when we launched those initial groups on the Passion of the Christ, I didn't even tell my established group leaders what we were doing. Part of it was we'd only decided 3 weeks before to start doing it, but we were focused on new leaders. Now, they came up to me and asked if they could be a part of it. Of course, we let them be a part of it. But whatever's working for those 30%, let it work for those 30%. And don't upset that, because otherwise you'll go from having 30% in groups to having 0 in groups, and that's not progress in my book. So Bible studies that are already going on, adult Sunday school classes, adult Bible fellowships, if those things are working for someone, even if you don't perceive it as being the future of your church, allow them to continue. I mean, unless they're talking bad about the pastor or worshiping the devil or something, I mean, I wouldn't get in the way with that. And when you have an alignment, you would invite them to be a part of the alignment, but I wouldn't require it. It doesn't make it any better that everybody's doing the exact same thing. It's kind of a nice synergy, but it's not worth the fight. So think about this. If you have 30% of your people in groups then effectively 70% of your people have said no to how you're currently presenting groups to them. And so my question is this, not that you have the wrong system, the wrong strategy. If you've got 30% of your people in groups, you're in the top 1/2 of 1% of all churches in America. But if 70% have said no, then here's where you have to start thinking. You have to give them something to say yes to. So if for whatever reason, the format, the curriculum, the methodology, the process, whatever it is that you're doing now, you need to think about the balance of your members and why did they say no to that? They may be involved in other things. So maybe you're not looking for 70% more. Maybe you have people that are very involved in serving, or they're involved in Celebrate Recovery or Alpha or another program like that. Well, they're probably not going to do a small group on top of that. So deduct that from your number, and maybe you don't need 70%, maybe you need 50%, but you want to give them something different, something that they would say yes to. Change something. Remember my 5-year plan? For 7 years, I asked people the same question. Do you want to lead a group? If they said no to that, then I needed to give them something to say yes to. So after 7 years, we changed from handpicking leaders to inviting people to host a group in their home. And then 2 years later, of inviting people to host a group in their home, I stood in an empty briefing room with no new hosts, wondering why we failed, questioning the call of God on my life. No, people said yes to that for 2 years, and then I got a no. So we didn't quit. We didn't overhaul the whole thing because we had good success. We started asking people to gather together with their friends and to grow, that they would invite the people that they would do the study with, and they would be connected. So here's what I'm trying to say. You don't have to do 5 things to get past 30% of your adults in groups. You don't have to do an aligned series. But here's what I'm saying. Just one change could get your groups unstuck very quickly. Maybe it's a change in the requirements. Maybe it's a change in how the senior pastor is involved. Maybe it's a change in the type of curriculum or the pattern that you're offering. Maybe it's doing video. Maybe it's just starting a coaching structure so that you support the groups that you have. But again, in all of this, begin to think about what you might change that's going to improve things at your place. So I'm going to talk to you a minute about maybe how I can help your church. And if you stay to the end of this webinar, I'm going to give you a little bonus. So hang in with me for a few minutes. And I'm keeping notes. I see if you drop it off. But here's the thing. After 25 years of ministry and 10 years of coaching hundreds of churches like yours across North America, I've learned from my own trenches as well as from an amazing laboratory of churches ranging from 40 members to nearly 40,000 members. And so this is what I want to offer you is a 6-month coaching group. And so here's what we're going to be doing. In the coaching group, we're going to cover the current needs in your church's small group ministry, how to engage your senior pastor in groups, effective recruiting strategies, sustaining groups through coaching and training, the latest trends in curriculum, how to produce your own curriculum, effectively tracking your groups and what metrics to use, building groups while you're wearing a lot of different hats, creating a small group team, and other things. And again, in this coaching, what I want you to hear is, this is not cookie cutter. Right now, I'm working with 24, 25 different churches. And I've taken best practices from churches of all sizes, denominations, all regions of North America. And the things that I've learned that tend to work the best, I'm presenting those. But with each of the churches that I'm working with in a coaching group, we're spending some time individually talking about how does this work in my church? How do I take, because different parts of the country and even different churches culturally will adapt these principles in different ways. So basically right now with the 25 or so churches that I'm coaching, we're doing 25 customized versions of the same thing. So this isn't cookie cutter. No two churches are exactly the same. So we're trying to find that intersection of the best practices and then what's going on with your church. And that's usually the sweet spot that helps us the most. So here's what you get in the coaching group. Goal setting and strategic planning for your church. Again, it's very, very specialized, very customized. Executable timelines and support to achieve your goals. So we'll have a timeline from now until the new year and through the new year, if you're developing curriculum, if you're launching groups, where that would go. Regular teleconferences, similar to this, but not with me talking this much, but regular teleconferences with other churches and with me. And we kind of share, we learn from each other, which is really a cool thing. We have a private Facebook group where we would interact, outside of I would say offline, it is online, but interact outside of our group meetings. And that way we share with a community of people that are involved in my coaching and talk about issues that we're facing and problems that come up or solutions that we found. You would have access to the recordings of the group meetings. You would have tools, samples, intellectual property. They're going to help you get started. Sometimes it's hard to start with a blank piece of paper. So to have some kind of an example or some kind of a template that you could start with. I have a writing template if you want to create your own curriculum. I have a timeline that you plug in your start date, and it'll populate all the dates forwards and backwards to where you need to start thinking about developing curriculum, all the way to how do you get them into the next series. My book, I said, is coming out in February, but we'll be using the book as part of the class, with the group. This next group is going to start in October. It's actually starting on October the 19th, and it'll prepare you for a launch that you would do in the new year, take you through what you would do following that launch, if you're going to do an Easter launch or if you're just going to do a follow-up series, to help to sustain your groups after you've launched all of them in the new year. So a couple of things that this includes, I have a relationship with Church Teams. So if you're looking for a small group database, Church Teams is by far the best small group database on the planet. And I say that very unapologetically. And so if you're in my coaching group and you want to sign up for Church Teams, I can actually waive the sign-up fee for you, and then you would just pay the first year. And that varies depending on the size of your church. You would have lifetime access to my 2 online courses, Leading an Exponential Group Launch and Coaching Exponential Groups. You would have 6 one-on-one consultations. So you'd have a monthly meeting with me, and then you would have meetings twice a month with the group, and then in addition to that, the Facebook group. And so these bonuses are just under like $3,500. So how much does it cost? Well, when I coach churches individually, let me make sure this is right. Yeah, this is right. When I work with a church individually, they pay me anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 a month for 12 months. When I was working for Life Together, they paid anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 a month for 12 months. And it's the same coaching. The 6-month coaching group is $500 a month for 5 months. So you sign up, you pay $500, and we set up automatic payments. And you get all of the goodness of these best practices delivered in a 6-month time period. If you're unhappy with this, you get into this and we're 30 days in, you've had a couple meetings, you've had a one-on-one with me, you've looked at the online courses and you go, this isn't really my thing. You know what? Just say the word and I'll give you your money back. And we'll hopefully still be friends after that. But if you give this a try and it doesn't work, then I owe you something in addition to money. And so I would probably give you a little bit of free coaching to help you get going. An additional bonus would be this: if you register in the next 2 weeks, between now and the end of the month, then I would do an online church assessment where we would gather some data about your church, and then I would present to you the findings and some recommendations in a consultation. And if you register in the next 2 weeks, I would actually give you this assessment. Last church I did this with paid me $1,500 plus travel expenses because I traveled to their place. If you want me to travel to your place, then it's going to cost a little bit more. But anyway, but I would do this online and deliver it over to GoToMeeting. And so the other thing about it is also if you sign up in the next couple of weeks, we can start working now. We don't have to wait till October the 19th. And so we can get a jump start on where you guys are headed in the new year. All right, so if you're interested, then let's talk. You can just send me an email, alan@alanwhite.org. Let me know that you're interested. If you have specific questions about the coaching program, then I'd be glad to have you email me and we could talk about that. So the bonus, because you made it to the end, I saw the ones that were naughty and jumped off, so I'm keeping track. But anyway, for sticking with me to the end, I'm going to offer you 20 minutes of my time. And so what I'm going to do is I'll send you a link to my schedule through an app called Schedule Once. You click the link, you find a day and time that'll work for you, you just set that up. This is not a sales call. What I want to do, I tried to call a few of you before the webinar, but this is a time where if questions that you asked in the registration process weren't answered in the webinar, then we would take this 20 minutes and talk about what's going on with your church. And again, I'm not going to like twist your arm and please sign up for this thing or any of that stuff, because I hate that when people do it to me, so I'm definitely not going to be doing that to you. So again, if you're ready to take your next step, just email me, alan@alanwhite.com. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to open up the microphones, and I will be around here for a little bit, and be happy to answer any of your questions. I've got a meeting at the top of the hour, but I will stay on as long as you have questions. And I noticed there were several that popped up in the chat as I was going, and I didn't slow down enough to answer those questions, so I'll go back and look at those now. But if you have a microphone, go ahead and speak up. Otherwise, you can put your question in the chat window. A couple questions that came up in the chat from before. Are you saying that a centralized group curriculum will not work? No. In fact, different churches do things different ways. Some churches, all the groups are studying the same thing. Some churches, they're studying a variety of things. I think, whatever's going to work for you. I'm in favor of that, and if it gets to a point where it's not working for everybody, then I would encourage you to change that up a little bit. You seem to suggest the senior pastor sermon-based curriculum is the best way to go. In my experiences, that's what I found. And in the churches I worked with last year, the 18 churches that started over 5,000 groups, most, if not all of them, created one or more video-based curriculums. And the reason I like video-based curriculum is actually two reasons. One is it's easy to use. If somebody can access the video online, or if they can operate their DVD player, they don't have to be the teacher, and it takes the pressure off of them. The second reason I like video-based curriculum is that as a pastor, you have control of what's being taught in the group, because what's being taught in the group is the video with the pastor's teaching. And when I was at the larger church, my pastor did one that was 8 weeks, and that was daunting for him to do that as well as speak every week. And so what we did after that was we actually had other teaching pastors involved in creating the video, so that he would do maybe the first one and the last one, or we would alternate or whatever, but he didn't do all of them. But again, those, to make it easy to use, and the fact that you have the assurance of what's being taught in the group, I think those are significant reasons to give this a try. Any other questions or thoughts? I'd be happy to take that as I'm scrolling through the chat box here. Well, while your wheels are turning, I'll answer another one from the chat. It says your groups are based on Bible study curriculum. What happened to building a community? That's a very good question. And I think in every group there are rhythms. And I'm a big advocate of experiential learning. So I don't think a group meeting always has to be a Bible study. It could be a prayer time. It could be going out and serving together, serving in the community. There are definitely seasons of the year that are difficult to do studies. During the Christmas season, I would rather see groups serve together or do something social together, focus more on group life. The same with summer. I mean, summer is just hard. And if groups choose to do a Bible study, then do a Bible study. But if they just want to do some things socially, I've had groups go camping together, go on vacation together. I've had groups go on a cruise together. And in fact, the one that went on the cruise met somebody from here, and when they came back, that person joined their group. So go figure. All right. What other questions or thoughts do you have? Oh, Ken's got one here. Did you have the senior pastor write questions from a sermon to use in the groups, or did you do the curriculum? I did the curriculum. And when I got smart, I formed a team of volunteers who would submit questions, so I wasn't writing all of the questions. If you have money and you don't want to write all of the questions. There's a service that Life provides called smallgroupsingular.com, and I think it's about $1,500 a year, and they'll write the questions for you. Jason says, I took over groups with coaching structure already. Coaching structure was poor. How do you lay it out expectations to current coaches from a bad structure? I think, Jason, I would sit down with each of the coaches and actually ask them to say, present a vision of this is what we want coaching to look like. And then say, now, is this something you feel that you're willing to do? Or if not, I'll give you an out. So you're not firing them. They're making a choice of, do you want to be involved in this way that we foresee small group coaching to work, or would you rather not? And I know it's an awkward situation, but just sit down and talk to them. Tell them what you expect. Maybe they're coaching too many. Maybe they're not coaching enough. Maybe they're not coaching at all. And then maybe at that case, it's making an offer to say, maybe this isn't the right place for you to serve, and maybe it would be better for both of us and take the pressure off if we just had you go ahead and serve in another way. Okay, so Adrian asked about tracking attendance. Different churches want different things. Some of the largest churches in the country track attendance once a year. Other churches want attendance weekly, like Sunday school attendance. I'm a big fan of church teams. I've already said that. And the reason I am is that every week after the meeting, it pushes an email out to the group leader, and it has their roster. They check off, who is attending the meeting that week. And then they have a place for comments, a place for prayer requests, and then they click save. And when they click save, that report goes to their coach. It goes to the small group director, small group pastor, whoever you want it to go to. And it's unique for each group. Then everybody knows what's going on in that group. And the other thing I think is really great is that sometimes a good small group leader is terrible at administrative tasks. And so church teams actually allows you to change who the report taker is in the group. So maybe you have somebody that's a little more task-oriented that will keep up on the reports, and then the leader doesn't have to worry about that so much. If that's not the way you want to go, a survey tool like SurveyMonkey has proven effective, maybe at least to get a snapshot during every semester and see what groups are going, who's in the groups, that sort of thing. But there are different ways to handle it. If your database is more centralized, and I'm not going to start complaining about databases because I have a long list, but the ones that it depended on my assistant to enter all the current information about the group, that was just a bad scene. And those databases didn't tend to survive. But the ones that were more user-friendly, that my leaders could actually input their information from home, I was a huge fan of those. All right, other questions or thoughts? You can either type something in the chat window, or you can speak up. Oh, somebody's asking about a copy of the presentation. I'll give you a recording of this presentation as well as the slide deck for you to review. And so with GoToMeeting, if you use it, one of the limitations is it'll show the screens and it'll have the audio. It won't show video, but there's not much video attached to this one, so you don't have to worry about that. But I'll make that available, send it out to you in an email following our time together. All right. Well, I'm willing to stay on for a few more minutes if anybody has questions. Otherwise, if you don't have questions, our webinar is effectively concluded, but I will stick around for a few minutes if you guys have any questions. I have to get to a coaching call in a little bit, but actually 2 this afternoon.